Officer Robert Martinez had been patrolling the quiet streets of Maplewood for nearly 25 years, and he thought he had seen everything that small-town life could offer him. The evening sun was casting long golden shadows across the tree-lined avenue when he noticed a small figure running toward his patrol car. A little girl in a bright pink dress was waving her arms frantically, and tears were streaming down her face as she approached his vehicle. Robert pulled over immediately and stepped out of his car with the gentle manner that had made him a beloved figure in the community. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and her blonde hair was disheveled from running. "Please, Mr. Policeman," she said between sobs. "You have to follow me home right now." Robert knelt down to her level the way his own father had taught him to do when speaking with children many years ago. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked in the softest voice he could manage. "I'm Emma," she replied, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. "And my daddy needs help, but he won't ask for it." Something in the child's voice told Robert that this wasn't a typical call about a lost pet or a scraped knee. He had learned over the decades to trust his instincts about people, especially when children were involved. "Can you tell me what's wrong, Emma?" he asked as he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Daddy hasn't been able to get out of bed for 3 days," she said with the matter-of-fact tone that children sometimes use when describing the most heartbreaking situations, "and we don't have any food left in the house." Robert felt his heart clench the way it had when his own children were small and faced with problems they couldn't solve on their own. "Where's your mommy?" he asked, though something in Emma's expression already told him the answer would be complicated. "Mommy went to heaven last Christmas," Emma said, with the acceptance that children show when they've had to grow up too quickly. "And Daddy cries sometimes when he thinks I'm not looking." The weight of those words settled between them like an invisible blanket, and Robert found himself thinking about his own father, who had struggled after his mother passed away when Robert was just a teenager. "Well, Emma," Robert said, standing up slowly, "I think we should go check on your daddy together." Emma's face brightened for the first time since she had run up to his car, and she slipped her small hand into his calloused one. They walked 3 blocks through the neighborhood that Robert had patrolled for so many years, and he noticed things he had somehow missed before. The small white house at the end of Elm Street had paint peeling from its shutters, and the lawn had grown a bit too long, but there were still flower boxes under the windows that someone had been trying to maintain. Emma led him up the front steps and opened the door with the familiarity of someone who had been taking care of herself for longer than any child should have to daddy. She called out as they stepped into the small living room, "I brought help." The house was tidy despite everything, and Robert could see that someone had been trying very hard to keep things normal family. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, and he could see the progression of a happy family through the years. A beautiful woman with kind eyes appeared in many of the pictures, always smiling and often holding Emma as a baby. The most recent photos showed just Emma and a man who looked like he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Emma," came a weak voice from down the hallway. "Who's here with you?" Robert followed the little girl toward the back of the house and found a man in his 30s, lying in bed looking as though he hadn't moved in days. The man's name was David, and when he saw the police uniform, his first instinct was to try to sit up quickly. "Officer, I'm sorry," David said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Emma shouldn't have bothered you." But Robert had already taken in the scene and understood what was happening here. This wasn't about crime or disturbance, but about a human being who had reached the end of his rope and was too proud or too broken to ask for help. "David," Robert said, using the man's first name because sometimes formality creates distance when what people need is connection. "Emma tells me you haven't been feeling well." The conversation that followed was one that Robert would remember for the rest of his career. David explained through tears that he had lost his job 2 months after his wife Sarah died and hadn't been able to find steady work since. He had been selling whatever he could to keep the electricity on and food on the table, but his savings were gone and his hope was nearly depleted. The depression had hit him like a physical illness, and some days he couldn't summon the energy to get out of bed, let alone look for work or take proper care of Emma. "I know I'm failing her," David said, looking at his daughter, who had climbed onto the bed beside him. but I just don't know how to move forward without Sarah." Emma patted her father's hand with the gentle wisdom that children sometimes possess and said, "It's okay, Daddy. The nice policeman is going to help us." Robert excused himself and stepped outside to make some phone calls. Over the years, he had built relationships throughout the community, and he knew that Maplewood was the kind of place where people looked out for each other when times got tough. His first call was to Pastor William at the Methodist Church, who had been coordinating community assistance programs for as long as anyone could remember. Within an hour, Pastor William arrived with bags of groceries and information about job opportunities at 3 local businesses. The second call was to Dr. Patricia Henderson, who had been the town's family physician for 30 years and understood that sometimes healing required more than medicine. Dr. Henderson came by that evening and spent a long time talking with David about grief and depression and the importance of asking for help. She arranged for him to see a counselor and prescribed medication that would help him through the darkest days. But the most important call Robert made was to his own wife, Margaret, who had always said that the measure of a community was how it treated its most vulnerable members. Margaret arrived with their neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, and together they assessed what Emma and David needed most. Within the week, they had organized a rotation of neighbors who would check in daily and make sure Emma had proper meals and someone to talk to while her father worked on getting better. Mrs. Thompson, who was recently widowed herself, seemed to find new purpose in helping Emma with homework and teaching her to bake cookies, the way her own grandmother had taught her decades earlier. The local grocery store manager quietly arranged for David to stock shelves during evening hours so he could still be home when Emma got out of school. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to cover the basics, and more importantly, it gave David a reason to get up each morning. Robert made it a point to stop by the house every few days, not in his official capacity, but as a friend who understood that sometimes the best police work happened when you took off the badge and just showed up as one human being helping another. Emma always ran to greet him with updates about school and her father's progress, and Robert found himself looking forward to those visits more than he had expected. As autumn turned to winter, David began to find his footing again. The grief would always be there, but he was learning to carry it without letting it crush him. Emma was thriving with the attention and support of what had become an extended family of neighbors and friends. One December evening, nearly a year after that first encounter, Robert received a phone call that made him smile. David had been promoted to assistant manager at the store and wanted to invite Robert and Margaret over for dinner to celebrate. When they arrived at the small house on Elm Street, Robert barely recognized the place. The paint had been refreshed, the lawn was neat, and the flower boxes were full of winter greenery. But more than the physical changes, there was something different in the air. David greeted them at the door, standing tall and looking like a man who had found his way back to hope. Emma ran to hug Robert the way she had every time she had seen him over the past months. "Officer Robert," she said with excitement, "Daddy and I made your favorite cookies, and we have something special to show you in the living room." The family photographs had been rearranged and new ones had been added, pictures of Emma's first day of school, David at his job promotion celebration, and dozens of images showing the community of friends who had become part of their daily lives. But in the center of the mantelpiece was a photo that made Robert's eyes well up with tears. It showed Emma, David, Robert, and Margaret at the church picnic the previous summer, all of them laughing at something Emma had said. Below the photo was a small handwritten note that read, "Family isn't always about blood, but about the people who show up when you need them most." As they sat down to dinner, David raised his glass of apple cider and looked around the table at the faces of people who had become so important to their lives. "A year ago," he said, "I thought Emma and I were alone in the world, and I didn't know how we were going to make it through." He paused and looked at his daughter, who was beaming with the confidence that comes from knowing you are loved and supported. "But this little girl," he continued, "taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, and that there are still good people in the world who will answer when you call." Robert thought about all the calls he had responded to over the years, and realized that this simple evening around a dinner table felt like the most important work he had ever done. Later, as he and Margaret drove home through the quiet streets of Ma.